To understand investing during the past 3 years required an extensive review of just how the American economy got into this predicament. What we found contradicts much of economic convention, particularly with regard to monetary policy. By analyzing decades of data, we have found that though the current contraction was caused by cyclical forces, its severity and lack of sustainable recovery are largely due to structural imbalances. These structural issues stretch back over 40 years, spanning multiple administrations and monetary regimes. What we see from the data is a distinct change in the very nature of economic recessions and their recoveries. Here, we have highlighted every recession event since 1948. This chart is composed of significant economic indicators, including segments of GDP. Negative changes are shown in yellow, while lavender signifies positive movements. In the period before 1965, recoveries are quite distinct, showing up as solid blocks of lavender. However, after the solid recovery in 1984, the recovery in 1991 and the recovery in 2002 show much less uniformity. Even more curious, in every single post-war recovery, unemployment has always stopped rising within 6 months of the end of each contraction. But after the 1990 recession, unemployment worsened right into the middle of 1992, almost 18 months after its end. After the 2001 recession, unemployment rose all the way through the middle of 2003, a full 2 years later. There had to be a reason for these significant changes. One reason is no doubt the larger influence of manufacturing in those earlier periods. Since the vast majority of economic activity was tied to the production of goods, recessions were functions of the inventory cycle and more attuned to changes in interest rates and inflation. As the economy neared full employment, inflation would rise as competition for workers increased. This fed into the process of inventory overbuilding as businesses sought to produce as much as possible before production costs rose further. To control inflation and overbuilding, the Federal Reserve would increase interest rates to make business financing more expensive, reducing economic activity, including inventory building, until inflation pressures subsided. But since interest rates are blunt instruments rather than surgically precise tools, reconstructive monetary policy would result in a recession. This dynamic was preserved until the Great Inflation, the period of runaway inflation from 1965 until 1983. In analyzing the causes of stagflation during that period, we found our answer to the change in recovery mechanics. Simply put, the Great Inflation was the first bubble, a buildup in personal savings. By 1983, asset income had grown to 13% of the GDP. As we shall see, this had profound effects on household spending. Earned income had been the sole factor for marginal consumer spending, but asset income became just as important. Before we examine how consumer spending patterns changed the recession recovery dynamic, we need to examine why asset income had grown so much. Going back to 1965, President Lyndon Johnson's dual government expansion for the Great Society and the Vietnam War meant a radical expansion of the federal government deficit. At that time, the Federal Reserve, under William Martin, felt its duty was to ensure smooth delivery of Treasury auctions. As the deficit grew, it became harder to finance, so the Fed had to expand the money supply significantly. At this point, federal government deficits were directly inflationary through Martin's Federal Reserve mandate. Initially, Martin wanted to control inflation through tax increases since fiscal policy had become the dominant force during that era. Economic thought at that time held that inflation could only be produced by wage pressures which were present from 1965 to 1970. Martin eventually relented and began to increase interest rates. After the 1970 recession, the Fed, now chaired by Arthur Burns and cooperating with the Nixon Treasury, felt that inflation would recede as wage pressures eased. Inflation was only temporarily halted by the recession in 1970. Once the economic weakness had passed, inflation was once again accelerating. The rate increases pushed on the credit markets by the Fed had the effect of attracting incremental savings dollars. Households began to react to the high rates by rapidly adding to savings balances in order to capture the greater interest income potential. The net result from additional savings was excess credit creation. That excess credit growth was cycled through business inventory, consumer credit, and home mortgages to produce consumer inflation. Business inventory itself is nothing more than future production moved forward. So in terms of inflation, excess inventory building has the same effect on prices as the increases in demand from consumer credit. Since businesses finance their inventory, without an excess of credit, the inventory feedback loop would never last. Once inflation takes hold, just as consumers have incentives to spend before prices rise, businesses seek to produce as much inventory as possible before input costs rise further. This puts upward pressure on prices throughout the supply chain. The increase in prices convinces the Fed to raise rates, which attracts more household savings, creating more credit that can be turned into even more inventory and consumer spending. This process was augmented in late 1973 with the oil embargo, but it continued throughout the decade relatively unimpeded. The combination of consumer credit and inventory building took inflation where wage pressures could not. By 1980, inflation was solidly in double digits. Conventional wisdom has held that Paul Volcker's Fed raised interest rates so high that the resultant double-dip recessions were severe enough to tame it. By 1983, inflation was normalized, and the United States began a prolonged period of stable growth with low inflation. Our view of the data is quite different from convention. The rate increases in and after 1977 continued the same pattern of attracting more household savings that generated excess credit production. Households were receiving so much aggregate interest income that traditional trade-off of spend or save had been temporarily replaced by spend and save. Being able to absorb inflation while increasing savings balances kept the inflation cycle looping even though it was reaching incredulous levels. Businesses had begun to run into profit issues by 1979 due to the rapid acceleration of inflation. Companies were becoming increasingly unable to pass input cost increases onto the final consumers. With profitability in question, businesses were increasingly unable to compete for costly credit. Household and banks began to shift credit from corporations to the U.S. Treasury. Even though corporate bond spreads were still 2 to 3% above treasuries, on a nominal basis that was not enough given the trade-off between a treasury yielding 13% and a similar corporate yielding 15%. Corporate credit was increasingly crowded out by the treasury. Once financing became an issue, inventory peaked and began to fall in early 1980, which coincided with a peak in consumer inflation. The inventory-led contraction continued on through 1983. The Fed reversed its policy twice during that span, finally sending deposit rates above 20%. At that point, with unemployment rising rapidly, households were back into spend versus save trade-off, choosing to spend. The nasty recession in 1982 and 83 finalized the reduction in inflation that had begun with an inventory peak 3 years earlier. That might sound somewhat like the conventional narrative, but the Fed never addressed the accumulation of savings. It may have had a hand in forcing the inventory contraction, but that misses the critical fact that the time period was much more complex than a simple function of increasing interest rates to retard economic growth and thus inflation. Believing its policies to be successful because they produced the desired result, the Fed ignored collateral consequences. In the early 1980s, the Fed thought it had solved the problem, but in failing to address the overhang of savings, the banking system had the money sources for yet another credit expansion once weakness receded. Worse yet, monetary engineering would lead to major distortions in the banking system, consumer spending, and household balance sheets.